Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. We are now heard across the globe. Welcome to the Middle East Forum of Falmouth Lectures. I am Alan Taylor, President of the Middle East Forum of Falmouth. For those of you new to the forum, we are a 501c3 nonprofit volunteer-run organization founded in 2006. Over the course of each season, we present a series of talks that represent a broad range of perspectives and opinions addressing the complex issues facing the Middle East. Needless to say, the Middle East is in dynamic flux and continues to demand our attention. The sands keep shifting, and currently priorities and ambitions of America are difficult to parse. We have learned so much from our first 4 lectures. Trita Parsi described the fluid situation in and with Iran. James Lindsay explained missions, accomplishments, and failures of the United Nations Relief Work Organization, UNRWA, and that dire situation plays in every newscast. A month ago, Stephen Cook shared his perspectives regarding U.S. policy as it relates to and influences engagement between Arabs, Iranians, Israelis, and Turks. 2 weeks ago, Farah Badur brilliantly illuminated the many facets of the Jordanian body politic, about which we are poorly informed. She described the many balances that have to be achieved to keep Jordan stable and functional. And then there's Turkey, another key player in the Middle East tightrope. In this final lecture for the Middle East Forum Falmouth 2025 season, our perspective and our understanding of this complex situation will be deepened considerably by Ms. Aydintasbas, despite it being midnight in Turkey, and thank you so much for staying awake for us. This talk follows on her important articles in the Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times. Is Turkey unstable? Are its relations with other Middle East countries changing? There is so much flux going on, and I think this talk will enable us to understand far more about what's going on, including Turkey's relation with Israel. Before I forget, please use the question and answer, the Q&A, at any time during the talk. And I'll now turn the program over to Dr. Barbara Fury, who will moderate the talk with Dr. Aydintasbas, and she will take your questions.
Thank you, Alan. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Aslı Aydintasbas, to tell us about Turkey's regional ascent amid democratic decline. A graduate of Bates College and New York University, Aslı is currently a fellow in the Center on the United States and Europe at the Brookings Institution and the director of its Turkey project. She's also a senior associate fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Prior to joining the foreign policy community in 2016, Aydintasbas had a long career in journalism, both in Turkey and in commenting on Turkey for international media. Her articles have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Forbes, Politico, and Newsweek, as well as in several Turkish newspapers. Recent publications include Turkey and Israel Risk Sliding Towards Confrontation in the Financial Times, Axis of Unease, What Europeans Should Do to Manage Turkey-Israel Rivalry for the ECR-FR, and a foreword to the Brookings Turkey debate series, Re-Energize the Turkey Debate in Washington, and other Brookings publications, including Understanding's Turkish Response to the Israel-Gaza Crisis. Now I will turn the program over to Aslı Aydintasbas. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara, and thank you, Alan. It's really wonderful to be here. Even though I'm joining from Istanbul, late for me, I know you are all having a pleasant Sunday afternoon. And typically, I live in Washington, D.C., not Istanbul, but I so happen to be in town both for research and to see some old friends after a wonderful vacation in Greece. Now, the topic is Turkey's regional ascent amid democratic decline. I think that says it all, and you probably know where this topic will go. It's a story that has that is sweet and sour. yes, Turkey is a major player right now in the region. It's no longer the kind of sleepy giant that it used to be. Turkey was always obviously a strategically important country, even throughout the Cold War. But it was a quiet and loyal member of the NATO alliance that would occasionally, with whom there would occasionally be a flare up in topics such as Cyprus, but typically it was punching under its weight. Now there's a new Turkey. There's a new Turkey with a changing geopolitical identity. At the heart of it, there's a very central figure, Tayyip Erdogan, that many of you have heard of. And it is also, thirdly, maybe, it's also very consequential. Of conflicts that are happening right now in its neighborhood, war in Ukraine, the Black Sea, European security, Gaza, Syria, but also its relationship with great powers is changing in a new age where we don't really know the rules right now of the game. All we know, and something that we keep saying, the old order is crumbled, but we don't know what the new order will be. Well, I think that Turkey is one of the countries that will play a key role in whatever emerges out of all this mess we're finding ourselves in. So in this short conversation, I want to give time for us to have a conversation and questions. So what I'm going to do is give you a brief overview of what Turkey used to be, what it is today, and how it's affected by the turmoil and the two wars, and maybe a forward-looking trajectory, a couple of ideas about where it's going. Some of you, I know Alan has been to Turkey, he said 20 years ago. I'm sure some of you have been to Turkey. For somebody who's over 50, there's a very specific, or 60, there's a very specific context. Turkey as a staunch Cold War ally, a NATO country. Turkey, which is a secular country, secular Muslim, but secular. And Turkey that played a role as NATO's second largest army in keeping the Soviets out throughout the Cold War. I am old enough to remember a time in Washington when I used to be a journalist, when people would attend, there would be so many Turkey events, Turkish-American relations, like several every week sometimes, and people would go around with pins, Turkish and American flags. Well, that is gone. That kind of sentiment, that kind of a relationship, that level of sympathy in both directions is gone. It used to be that Turkey was not just a staunch ally of United States during the Cold War, but it was also a country where the security relationship between the mill-to-mill partnership was at the center of the relationship. Turkey was also a country where the founding ideology was defined as Kemalism, the followers of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, meaning a very staunchly secular, pro-Western Muslim country. I think that that Turkish-American relationship and that framing has continued pretty much until, I would say, well into the Obama years, the Obama administration. But gradually, both the geopolitical changes and Turkey's own changing identity has actually brought new tensions and new dynamics and a new form of relationship with Turkey. I think that in talking about Turkey's long march, there's democracy, there's Islam, but there is one central figure that I want to start talking about. That is Tayyip Erdogan, which Turkey's president now, who has been the leader of the country for almost 23 years. He's obviously a controversial figure, both in Turkey and in the West. In Turkey, because he's, you know, very divisive, meaning, you know, you either love him or hate him. And, you know, it's a little bit like President Trump. Every election has been about whether you like Erdogan or not, or hate him in Turkey over the past decade and a half. I think it is a bit like that in the US now. It's about what you think about Donald Trump. It's no longer necessarily about policies and political ideology. It's about one person, one personality, a big personality, and voters' feelings about that. So Erdogan comes in initially in early 1990s as a young and charismatic mayor of Istanbul. His first name is Recep Tayyip Erdogan. And, you know, he came from Islamist background, at odds with the more establishment, secular, Kemalist view, but he was disciplined. He was pious, but telegenic. And unlike many Turkish politicians at the time, he actually got things done. He cleaned up the city, fixed the traffic, improved water services, and so on and so forth. You know, the fact that he seemed very competent has won him at a time when Turkish politics seemed very bankrupt, to be very honest. That has won him a good deal of sympathy with the voters, because at the time Turkish politics was pretty much a soap opera. In 1998, he recited a poem and with Islamic undertones, Islamist or undertones, and was sent to prison for 3 days. And that really made him, you know, wildly popular. A martyr to some, a warning sign to others, but he launched his own party, a Justice and Development Party, and in 2002 swept to power. That was 23 years ago. He's been at the helm of Turkish politics since then. Initially, the AKP, Erdogan's rule was marked by what some have called the Turkish Spring, you know, the accession towards the European Union, the economy boomed, reforms, and you know, Erdogan and his friends came up with an expression, Muslim Democrats, and they would say, we are just like Christian Democrats, except Muslim. So therefore, you know, we're pursuing democratization, but we happen to be privately pious. And hence Turkey actually pushed ahead with EU accession talks. Poverty fell, infrastructure was, you know, spreading like wildfire, new roads, new airports, and both at home and abroad, Erdogan was somewhat appreciated. He was on the cover of Time magazines in Brussels. The European Union saw him as a leader that they can finally do business with. And meanwhile, you had reforms in human rights front, the Kurdish issue, an opening, and so on and so forth. But things have started turning south, I would say, starting in 2013 with what is now typically called Gezi riots, the urban uprising in Istanbul that started off in Istanbul. It was originally against a very construction, tearing down a park downtown Istanbul, but spread around the country, millions of people, mostly secularists, you know, coming out in the streets and protesting the government. And that changed something. That changed something. Maybe that was the understanding, you know, it coincided with the Maidan square in Ukraine, with the Tahrir Square in Egypt that started the Arab Spring. and which obviously spread around the region. And Turkish authorities, I think the government felt this is coming, this is serious, this is a real threat, but that also they had this idea, erroneously, I would say, that it was foreign, externally motivated, organized by external powers, deep cynical conspiracies, the West trying to bring Erdogan down, and so on and so forth. So that really, not only did it deepen the polarization in Turkey, but it created a paranoid national security state, resulting in an Erdogan which got a government which got incrementally more authoritarianism since that time. Obviously, the coup attempt in 2016 was serious, and that has also fueled that drive. And what we have is a Turkey that now is very firmly under President Erdogan's reign. The governing party, Justice and Development Party, is which is sort of an Islamist party, but more conservative in the Turkish context, definitely Sunni. But they have become more and more authoritarian also in their leanings. They're facing an anti-Erdogan population, but it's just sort of every election is a push and pull. Meanwhile, Turkey has pretty much abandoned its EU reform agenda and ambitions. It is very confident, externally speaking, in terms of its foreign relations. I think that one thing President Erdogan has done is what I call the birth of a post-Western Turkey, a Turkey that has that no longer sees itself as a loyal card-carrying member of NATO or the Western Club, a country that has its own ambitions. In an age of great power, rivalry, and multipolarity in this part of the world, with U.S. hegemony, so to speak, in decline, I think Turks see an opening for themselves, for greater to rebuild, I would say, the Turkish Empire. Ottoman Empire is back, very popular theme. When I was in Turkey, when I was growing up in Turkey, or at least when I went to school in Turkey early in my life, Ottoman Empire was not seen as a positive model. It was basically seen and taught at schools as a backward model for governance, a poor model for governance which collapsed. And that the republic, the secular Kemalist republic of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, the other big towering figure in Turkish history, was sort of forward-leaning, pro-Western, modernizing, and so on and so forth. Well, today the mood in the country is very, very different. You have a nostalgia for the Ottoman Empire. You have arabesque decor across town. You used to have mainly tourists from Europe and maybe other Western countries. Now, if you come through Turkey or visit Istanbul airport, you will see that it is not the West, but the rest. In Istanbul, there's a huge influx of Arab tourists, and particularly rich Gulf Arabs, and from other parts. There's also people coming to the city from Central Asia, from the Balkans, from Ukraine, Russia. Russians are in Antalya, Ukrainians are in Antalya. It is very much a big magnet for this part of the world. And Turkey is now understanding that it doesn't need to blindly follow the West. There's very few people who are defending relationship with the West right now. Instead, the idea that Turkey needs to go it alone, needs to be a standalone power, neither East nor West, that it needs to pursue a strategic autonomy, a course of autonomy, maybe stay in NATO, but also deal with Russia, maybe, and so on, or maybe stay in NATO, but also develop relations with Central Asia, and stay as a candidate for EU membership, but also pursue its own regional agenda. These have become very popular themes. So I would say that Erdogan has built a new contract with Turkish society. I call this post-Western Turkey. His framing is century of Turkey. He says this is going to be the century of Turkey. This has been his election after election. This has been his motto, with the notion that, past century Turkey was very passive and punching under its weight, and now is the time. And in parallel to all this rhetoric and narrative and nationalism, there is also an increase in Turkey's defense industry, homegrown defense companies, particularly drones and other things. It's a country that produces a lot of things, has a very broad cross-section of industrial output, but it is also more and more advanced in the defense industry. So Turkey's self-confidence, Turkey's pride in its own defense industry, its suspicion about the West, particularly since the coup attempt, which many people blame on the United States, or that's a long story. I'm happy to go into it if there are questions. Otherwise, it's sort of this rabbit hole that we'd get in. But all of these have led to a new identity. Turkey has also been more willing to flex its muscles externally, has done numerous incursions into Iraq, into Syria in 2016, 18, 2019, controlling now sort of territory in northern Syria, which is pretty much integrated into the Turkish electrical grid, and Turkish postal service, and Turkey pays for salaries and so on. So it's also had military incursions and established bases in Libya. So a very different Turkey. And I would say President Erdogan's primary contract with Turkish society is about making Turkey great again. Closing the parenthesis, and this is in quotation, of the Republic, of the secular Republic, and bringing back the Turkish Empire. And as a result of this, Turkey has been very, very much playing a balancing act in the war between Ukraine and Russia. It has continued to trade with Russia, but also sold weapons to Ukraine. It has a strategic relationship with Ukraine and controls, obviously, the Black Sea and the Straits, so has done a couple of things to help Ukraine. But on the other hand, it's kept a relationship with Russia. This is something Erdogan is very proud of. The balancing act, the balanced relationship. And it's very similar to the position Turkey took in World War II, by the way, between allies and and Axis. But let me talk about. So this part is the ascendance. Let me talk about highlight three issues here that I see as problems ahead of this sort of grand project of making Turkey great again. One is that it comes with a certain level of authoritarianism, as I mentioned before, which Turkish society is not embracing. Now, it's not the case that every country reacts to authoritarianism. Sometimes illiberalism societies do some type of an authoritarian bargain and accept a certain level of illiberalism, or feel they have to accept. But in Turkey, there's a very, very robust opposition movement. In 2024, last year, opposition parties swept across municipalities, all winning all big cities and even conservative hamlets. So, and President Erdogan has increasingly been a victim of his own power, because he's built a system that is more and more consolidated and centralized, a very personalized system. But the result is that he has become the focus of social grievances and political grievances. So the first issue is, authoritarianism, and the reality that Turkish society is not really on with that project. I will say that one event that is important to highlight here is March of this year, March 19th of this year, the arrest of the mayor of Istanbul. And when I say the mayor of Istanbul, don't just think of him as the mayor of any odd city. We're talking about a city of almost 20 million, bigger than most European countries, a big, big economy. So, but mayor of Istanbul, who was increasingly an opposition figure and certain to run against Erdogan in the upcoming presidential elections, was arrested on corruption charges. That was seen as a way for president, for the government for the president to do away with his primary rival. And I think that has further decreased the support and electability of the current government. Elections are not until 2028 or 2027, so we're not going to see. But Erdogan does have an authoritarianism problem of his own making, and as a result of that, an electability issue. The second is, I think that the second issue is not every country in the region is really on with the program of making Turkey great again. In 2017-18, regional powers started coalescing around the idea of seeing Turkish power. They've come to see, particularly in Eastern Mediterranean, Turkish power as being too assertive, too belligerent, and this has created interesting and unlikely bedfellows, where you had UAE, Greece, Israel, Egypt actually lining up into some type of a loosely defined stop Turkey axis. So that is another issue. Now, with the downfall of the regime in Syria in December of this past year, only 10 months ago, Turkey had a very major geopolitical win. The new rulers of Syria are actually a group that has been ruling a statelet of some type on the Turkish border. They have good relations with Turkish government, and of course Turkey is going to have a huge level of influence in Syria and sees it as its basically zone of influence. However, Syrian equation is not easy. Syria has not stabilized, and increasingly Turkey and Israel are butting in. They are really clashing in Syria for competing for power. So that is also and in Eastern Mediterranean too, Turkey and Cyprus, of course, the old story, but now with a new new topic, new theme, Turkey and Cyprus, and of course backing Cyprus is Greece, Turkey competing for hydrocarbon resources, and at times this has gotten very, very tense as far as geopolitical events go. In 2020, Turkish and Greek ships stared each other down, and it took Angela Merkel to call leaders on both sides to de-escalate. So obviously Turkey's story is yet to be written. I think that its ascendance is a reality. It is also a reality that Turkey is a middle power that is strategically so well positioned that it will likely be a regional hegemon, a regional superpower. But of course, there is a gap in reality between its ambitions and its real potential. Turkey also has to address the Kurdish issue, one of the primary sources of social political disgruntlement. Obviously, there has been a Kurdish separatist movement going back to 1984, but different, other than the counterinsurgency aspect of it, Kurds in Turkey have not for some of that time at least have struggled to maintain their cultural and ethnic identities. Since with AKP, many of those rules have been relaxed. So Kurdish identity, this is in part thanks to the EU accession process. Kurdish identity is more free, but the political identity and the Kurdish political movement is still having obviously major problems in Turkey. Kurdish mayors being elected but removed from office on grounds that they're supporting separatists and so on. And meanwhile, Turkey has started recently a peace process with the PKK, the Kurdish separatist movement. That's a good thing. And but with the region being so hot right now, and with clearly the Kurdish-Turkish rivalry seeping into, sort of spilling over into Syria, it's hard to say where that will go. Turkey will be a major player in the Black Sea security, in European security after the conflict in Ukraine. And once, if and when we see a ceasefire in Ukraine, it is the largest, it's an important Black Sea power. I think it has the strongest fleet, navy in the Black Sea right now, with the Russians having been so depleted. But of course, we don't know when a ceasefire is a possibility, given that the Alaska meeting has made it obvious to everyone that the two sides are really, really far apart. I would say that Turkey, the ascendance is there, but the democratic decline is also there. And with it comes issues like brain drain, young people wanting to leave the country, trying to get visas, trying to move abroad, not to mention the kind of depletion of at the human resources level of the state bureaucracy, and a sense of resignation, I think, about democratic politics. All these are also things that I have truly observed with great sadness when I was in Turkey. And so back to where I started out, Turkey, and this sort of really strange new Turkey that is not what we used to know, what we used to no longer the staunch Western ally, no longer the country that's desperately seeking EU relationship, a very self-confident country that is neither East nor West, doing a lot of balancing act, wants its place under the sun. For sure, you know, this I'm using, I guess, a quote from Bismarck, but you know, today in the Bosphorus, there was sort of a spectacle of Turkish Navy fleet passing by with people lining up. So there is a popularized understanding of Turkey's new military powers, but also no consensus on what needs to happen domestically. So this reminds me of what Samuel Huntington, the great Samuel Huntington, how he saw Turkey. He called it a torn country, one of the torn countries, one of the countries in between. He had identified a number of countries, a few of them, that were torn, and that were torn. By that he meant the secular, it was neither East nor West, that it would be, that it would always be a fault line, a civilizational fault line, and as well as have its own internal struggles between Islamism and West and pro-Western democracy and so on and so far. And that is exactly what Turkey is right now. In a sense, really torn country. Maybe this is a good place to end for now, and we can go over, see what our listeners want to say, or if they want to touch upon any particular aspect of the presentation, or if they have questions.
Sure. So there are several questions. One is whether you think that Erdogan is comfortable as a NATO member now, and if, I mean, you say that he's juggling these two relationships on both sides, but does his official membership in NATO put him at a disadvantage in being able to really play both sides?
Well, I think Erdogan likes to have a seat at the table. He thinks of himself as a global leader. In fact, his party base, they call him leader of the century in a very high, in a very exaggerated, you know, sense. Some of the journalists in pro-government papers keep mentioning that he is the leader of the century, that nobody has the kind of vision he has. All that propaganda aside, Erdogan is a skillful geopolitical actor. There's no harm in being in NATO, and having a seat at the table is preferable to being outside. Turkey does not go with NATO consensus on some issues, including the war in Ukraine, obviously, but it is important enough and has a military strong enough that no NATO country is discussing kicking Turkey out. In any case, you can't. There are no protocols for that. It's an organization that people have tried to enter, but nobody knows how you exit NATO. So I think President Erdogan understands that it's leverage for him. Turkey also finds its relationship with NATO important. Its relationship, but it's no longer the sole security alliance for Turkey. It is more, it's an important security partner, but not Turkey's sole defense strategy. I would say that NATO countries understand that, but they would rather have Turkey on board and at the table than outside.
Okay. I have several related questions on what you think about how you would describe Israeli-Turkish relations, and related to that, what is behind Erdogan's support of Hamas?
Okay, Turkish-Israeli relations are interesting. Obviously, these two countries were very close when I was a young journalist. You know, having a Turkish name as I traveled in Israel was sort of like would open all doors for you, because the relationship was so tight. And I will remember, like, a colleague who was working, I believe, for Newsweek would be like, how do you get these interviews? And all I had to be like, I'm actually Turkish. And there was a strategic relationship and a military relationship, and one that worked for both sides. But as Turkey got more confident and started having a growing appetite for regional leadership, things started to change. Not to mention the fact that Erdogan's party comes from Islamist roots and also has been defending the democratic politics for Islam, for the Muslim world, even if it means Islamists coming to power through elections. Of course, this is anathema to Israel, but also Egypt and the Gulf countries. Erdogan has always defended Hamas as a legitimate political actor, and he reacted to October. Initially, I think after October 7, he and the Turkish public was shocked. In the first few weeks, there was sort of condemnation of what happened, but gradually, as the conditions started getting dire in Gaza, especially sort of with constant 24/7 coverage here of what is happening in Gaza, and sort of the kind of humanitarian tragedy that you see in a way that you don't really see in the West. When I watch the news here, it's very different from what I see. Obviously, we're all following the news in some fashion, but here it's very visual and all the time, very present. And so he reacted to that in a very undiplomatic and even sort of, I think, non-savvy way, defending Hamas as a legitimate, not just as a legitimate counterpart, but also calling them freedom fighters. And he has continued that line. Erdogan pretty much believes that this is a genocide and that Hamas is defending Palestinian people. I think that and relations with Israel have gotten worse and worse, because of Erdogan's support for Hamas, is very public and emotional outbursts about what is happening in Gaza. And because of Syria, where the two countries both want to carve out a zone of influence for themselves. They are competing, and the competition has actually, the rivalry has moved towards an enmity at this point, and they tend to see it as a zero-sum game, especially in the Syrian space, and it is very, very dangerous. You typically need, this is not the first round of tensions between Turkey and Israel. It's happened with Marmara Flotilla. Turkish public has always been very sensitive on the Palestinian issue. The first Turkish prime minister, the first Turkish leader to call what was happening in the West Bank a genocide was Prime Minister Bülent Ecevit, I believe it was in 2000s, and he came from secularist background, and and he even called it a genocide. So you have a public here which is very sensitive, perhaps more so than many Arab countries, on the Palestinian question. And the fact that it resonates so much, and the fact that President Erdogan is basically a very emotional person and wears his, sort of, and is very undiplomatic and is not shy from picking fights, has created this Erdogan Netanyahu personalized vendetta, a dynamic that has now led to a situation in which there is no relationship between the two countries. There's no channels, there's no conversation. This dangerous, dangerous escalation in the Syrian space.
Is there any, I'm curious whether, given our current administration, our new administration, very different from the last, are these problems that totally undermine or are detrimental to the US-Turkish relationship, or is there some personal connection between Trump and Erdogan that is different from previous administrations?
Yeah, so US-Turkish relationship has been very much up and down over the past decade. Very much, so much so that Turkey is subject to CAATSA sanctions for having purchased Russian anti-missile systems, and things did not really improve under President Biden, who wanted to keep Erdogan at a distance because of his framing of democracies versus authoritarian regimes. He basically wanted to send a message across to Turkey that that the sort of authoritarian direction meant that there would be limits to engagement with Washington. President Trump is very different, of course. He does not care about human rights and democratic evolution. He does not think that to be a meaningful yardstick for foreign policy, but also he has had he's long had a relationship with Erdogan. And in fact, some call it a bromance. I've heard on both sides it being called bromance. I think that is probably an exaggeration, as Erdogan does not speak English. But what they have in common is sort of a cynicism about liberalism and liberal world order, about issues like human rights and sort of globalists and global elites, but also a sort of hardcore transactionalism. They like to do things, they like to combine economic development with foreign policy issues, and do so in a very transactional manner, which is very difficult for us, even me as a foreign policy expert, because it's so outside of the conventional methods of diplomacy that we know. I am telling my colleagues at Brookings that we do need to get used to this new way the world works, in which businessmen and billionaires and sort of special envoys and friendly governments and former rivals, etc., and authoritarian regimes, everybody is talking to each other in a very, very fast and transactional manner, and we are having a really hard time understanding this new dynamic where every rule that we know of is actually broken. But to make a long story short, yes, Erdogan and Trump do get along. I expect a White House visit at some point. There was none under the Biden administration. President Trump has made it very clear that he's not going to make human rights in Turkey an issue. But I think that the Trump administration does want to help Turkish, does want to play a role in mediation role in Turkish-Israeli tensions, but the administration seems so distracted with the war in Gaza and the war in Ukraine and everything else that I don't think they have been able to focus on it. Having said all that, today I was just reading in the news that Tom Barrack, a Trump ally, another billionaire friend, and a sort of a businessman who's now the ambassador to Turkey, has also had a very big portfolio, not just ambassador to Turkey, but also covering Lebanon and Syria. And he went over into Israel today to discuss some of these issues, all of these issues with Netanyahu, including Lebanon, Syria, and relations with Turkey. So there's some effort, but I don't really think Turkey will change, and I don't think Israel will change. You have a government, far-right government here, far-right government there. They're sort of both coming from, they both rely on the fringes of the political movements in their countries, and so they would find it very difficult, I think, to make a peace anytime soon.
Okay, we have some questions asking about Turkey's relationship beyond the countries we've talked about, in particular, Turkey's relations with the Balkan countries in the context of the revival of Ottoman Empire nostalgia, and also their current relationships between Turkey and Greece.
Yeah, with Greece, there is a new and, in my view, much needed normalization effort now. For a while in 2020, things were very, 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 very tough and unpleasant. And when tensions rise, it is, you sort of in this part of the world, you write it off as political gimmicks and maybe electoral dynamics and stuff. But sometimes there are accidents which lead countries to actually go much further than what they intended. Turkey and Greece, they have a number of issues over the Aegean, over Cyprus, which they have not sorted out. It's just, but these issues have been there for the past 40 years, and neither side is able to move on these. But if they can freeze, perhaps park the questions for now, and develop and focus on a positive agenda, including economic cooperation, they would be doing themselves a favor, particularly in terms of being able to benefit from the incredible wealth and resources and the potential of the Aegean. I think it's very hard, again, because of the sort of Greek fear of Turkey's rise, Turkish resentment of Greece and their power within the European Union in terms of what, according to Ankara, is halting their advancement towards the EU. But it's still, at least right now, there's no tensions, and that's something. Other than that, Balkans, and for a while, Turkey had grown in influence in the Balkans. That is 2010, 2011, 12, 13, 14. I think that kind of was in partnership with the Gulen movement. And so there was this AKP, the Justice and Development Party, Turkey's ruling party, had some type of an alliance with the Gülen movement and relied on them as human resources, particularly in terms of NGOs and schools and sort of developing relations with business communities in these regions and so on and so forth. But with the coup attempt in 2016 and with the government putting the blame, government identifying the Gülen movement as one of the backers of the coup, that relationship has soured, and so has Turkey's, I would say, outreach in these countries. There still is a government-driven outreach, but it's not the same kind of level of expansion. And I say that's not necessarily being, not necessarily thinking that Gülen movement was without a blame for, Turkey's democratic decline. They also contributed to that in their alliance with AKP and certainly in the run up to the coup. But I have to say that they were providing the government with the kind of human resources it needed, and that seems to be a story that is not really covered well, but I see it every day now in bureaucracy and in sort of not having the sort of vision and the soft power and the desire for soft power, instead relying more and more on hard power. But the Balkans, Erdogan has a very good relationship with Balkan leaders. There is a Turkish potential for soft power, but you no longer have the kind of schools and the institutions and bureaucracy and the outreach that you used to have it, I would say, a decade ago.
Talking about soft power and humanistic things, there's a question here to take us in a little direction. This person is curious about Erdogan's specific social welfare policies and how successful they have been. Would you characterize him as neoliberal or more social democratic?
Oh, it's an interesting question. It's hard to, but both. Meaning Erdogan has done really well in his first decade in social programs. There's no doubt about it. It was partly the IMF program that Turkey, the standby agreement that Turkey had been following, and partly applying the models he had developed during his time in Istanbul municipality in terms of reaching out to the needy, the lower income brackets, etc. And so it led to AKP's electoral success, election after election. At some point in Turkey, I remember having researched it, at some point in Turkey, a significant chunk of the population, meaning something in the vicinity of 23 million people, were receiving out of 82 at the time, now more like 86, but 23 million were receiving some type of a social aid, stipend, some type of a benefit from social welfare programs. And that has really made him sustained his popularity. The downside was splurging ends up catching up with you on the economy. President Erdogan has also run the economy down to the ground, basically, through his sort of largesse, especially before elections, and he's also been very business friendly. There's no doubt about it. But one thing Turkey has experienced is the more personalized the regime got, the worse the economy It doesn't matter that you're very business friendly, that you can call up a leader and you can do these big mega deals. If the institutions are breaking down, and if decision making is more concentrated at the top, economy does not function. And this should be a lesson to everybody. You know, I think in theory we know about the importance of independence of institutions, but in reality, I think we watched this in Turkey, a train, sort of a slow motion train wreck from 2016. 17, 18, 19, you know, as Erdogan consolidated power, he started wanting to take decisions on the economic front, decisions on the business front, leading to huge mistakes, but also huge decline in investor confidence and consumer confidence.
Thank you. This has been so informative, Asli. It's very late there, I know, and so I'm going to thank you for a very informative and clearly presented talk and providing lots of food for thought. And I will turn the meeting over back to Alan.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Barbara, for aggregating so many questions from so many different people and diverse perspectives. And thank you, Asli, for a fabulous talk. We're so grateful to you for taking the time from your hectic schedule, especially at this turbulent time and the late hour for you, and to be with us this afternoon and for such an articulate, thoughtful, historically, politically, religiously, and economically contextualized talk, and helping us understand the importance of Turkey's regional assets in the Middle East and informing us about the changes within Turkey that also change the international dynamic. We're so grateful for the sophistication and the depth that you share with us, your focused presentation, and the insights that we've gleaned that enable us to better understand and be more active citizens here in the U.S. It was a great way to complement and end the series of talks we've had this year. So thank you so much. We're really grateful. We'll see you in a few minutes. And now to the audience, I'd like to thank you all.
Alan, for reaching out and inviting me and thanks everyone for the great questions. And Barbara, thank you for moderating.
My pleasure.
Thank you. And to our audience, I'd like to remind you that MEFF is a donor-supported organization. We're totally volunteer-run, and your donations enable us to continue these lectures, and we will do so for the 2026 year. We welcome your suggestions for future speakers, and you can send your input to infomeff, that's infomeff.world@gmail.com. Please contribute so that we can continue to run this Zoom series, which is quite costly. And I want to again thank Aslı Aydintasbas again for sharing her deep understanding of the situation in Turkey and how it affects the region. And wherever you are, we thank all of you for participating in this series of webinars. And like I said, we serve you and rely on you for your support, and have a great rest of your season. And we'll see you in 2026 with another stellar lineup of speakers who will inform us about the ever-shifting sands of the Middle East and how these sands will engage us. So be well. See you next year.